Isaac Levitan painted the most recognizable landscapes in Russia. But Russia expelled him twice. He was Jewish. That alone was enough. And maybe that is why his paintings feel different from almost every landscape that came before them. A frozen road disappearing into empty fields. A church alone beside black water. Snow melting beneath a weak afternoon light. His paintings look quiet until they begin to feel personal. Because when you look long enough, something shifts. Those roads, those rivers, those silent skies, they are not really showing you nature. They are showing you the emotional consequences of rejection. Most landscape painters try to show us where a place is. Levitan showed us what a place can do to a human being. And the strange thing is this: the more empty his paintings become, the more personal they feel. No crowds, no historical spectacle. Almost no narrative at all. Just fields, roads, snow, water, silence. And yet somehow they feel more human than portraits. As if the loneliness of one man slowly dissolved into the Russian landscape itself. But to understand how that happened, we have to begin much earlier. Before the paintings. Before recognition. Before Russia decided he did not belong inside the country, he would one day define visually for the rest of the world. Levitan was born around 1860 into a poor Jewish family in what is now Lithuania, then part of the Russian Empire. Almost immediately, his life became unstable. Movement, displacement, financial insecurity. His family eventually moved to Moscow searching for opportunity, but opportunity was selective in Imperial Russia. A Jewish child learned very quickly where invisible boundaries existed, not necessarily through violence, through atmosphere. Through being the one left standing at the edge of a room while others moved toward each other without thinking. That kind of exclusion, subtle enough to become psychological, permanent enough to become a way of seeing. And that distinction matters enormously. Because Levitan's paintings are not filled with dramatic trauma. They are filled with emotional distance. The feeling of being near life without fully entering it. Then tragedy accelerated everything. Before reaching adulthood, he lost both parents. He was still a teenager. No money, no stability, no real home. At times he reportedly slept inside the very school where he studied painting. Not because he was romantic, because he was poor. And this is where something important begins to form. Most artists use painting to represent reality. Levitan used painting to survive emotionally inside reality. That difference would change landscape painting forever. In 1879, the Russian authorities expelled Levitan from Moscow. The reason was brutally simple. He was Jewish. Years later, in 1892, it happened again during another wave of anti-Semitic restrictions under Tsar Alexander III. Think about the contradiction hidden inside that fact. The artist who would become one of the great visual poets of Russia was treated as alien by the nation itself. And perhaps this is the emotional engine beneath all his work. Because Levitan painted Russia the way exiled people often love places, with painful intimacy, not patriotic intimacy, emotional intimacy. The intimacy of someone who notices everything because belonging is never guaranteed. And once you see this, his paintings begin to change. The roads no longer feel peaceful. You can almost hear wind moving across empty grass and hear nothing else. No voices, no movement except distance itself. The horizons stop feeling open. They feel unreachable. And the sunlight feels borrowed, as though beauty itself knows it may soon disappear. This is why Levitan's landscapes still feel modern. Because modern loneliness often works the same way. People live inside societies they no longer fully feel connected to. Near others, yet psychologically distant. Visible, yet emotionally displaced. Levitan understood that feeling long before psychology had language for it. His teachers recognized his sensitivity immediately. Alexei Savrasov taught him something revolutionary. Do not merely observe nature. Listen to it. Meanwhile, Vasily Polenov exposed him to light, atmosphere, and the fragile emotional transitions inside ordinary moments. But Levitan eventually went somewhere neither teacher fully reached. For him, landscape ceased to be geography. It became introspection. He called it the mood landscape. That phrase sounds harmless. It was not. Because Levitan transformed the landscape into psychological space. He did not paint a forest. He painted what silence feels like inside a forest when a person carries grief they cannot explain. He painted winter light fading from wet roads, smoke dissolving above distant roofs. The feeling of arriving home too tired to speak. This is why his paintings feel strangely contemporary. Even viewers who know nothing about Russian art often respond to them immediately. Because the paintings do not require intellectual decoding. They operate emotionally first. You feel them before you analyze them. And Levitan understood something most artists never fully understand. Human beings rarely reveal themselves directly. They reveal themselves indirectly, through atmosphere, through pacing, through silence, through what they cannot say aloud. His landscapes became emotional self-portraits without ever containing the artist physically. And that absence makes them feel even more intimate. But to understand where all this emotional weight was actually coming from, we need to look at what was happening to Levitan himself. Not in the paintings. In his life. There were moments when Levitan nearly collapsed completely. Friends described periods of severe depression so deep that he withdrew almost entirely from the world around him. At least once, he reportedly attempted suicide. And this changes the way we see the paintings. Because suddenly the silence inside them no longer feels merely artistic. It feels survived, not the silence of peace. The silence of someone who looked into the emptiness and had to find a reason to keep painting anyway. Which means every road, every fading horizon, every winter light you see in his work was made on the other side of that. Two years later, Levitan painted Above Eternal Peace. A small church beside an immense lake under an endless sky. Humanity reduced almost to nothing. But strangely, the painting does not feel cruel. It feels relieving. As if human anxiety finally encounters something vast enough to contain it. Most Western art places mankind at the center of existence. Levitan does something radically different. He removes us from the center entirely. And somehow that creates peace instead of despair. This may be one of the deepest psychological movements inside his work. The idea that suffering becomes lighter when the self stops trying to dominate reality. Not disappearance. Perspective. And older viewers often understand this instinctively. Because age changes the scale through which life is perceived. Ambition weakens. Time becomes visible. Mortality becomes concrete. Levitan's paintings never fight those realities. They sit quietly beside them. In 1895, Levitan painted March. And suddenly, after years of emotional heaviness, something shifts. Snow begins to melt. Water drips slowly from rooftops. Mud returns to the roads. Winter loosens one invisible inch at a time. Sunlight enters, not flooding in, not triumphant. Just arriving, cautious, almost questioning whether it is welcome here. A horse waits outside a wooden house. Nothing dramatic occurs, yet the painting feels almost miraculous. Because Levitan understood something most sentimental art misunderstands. Hope rarely arrives loudly. Real hope enters the way light entered that painting. Slowly, at an angle, not sure yet if it's staying, and that restraint makes it believable. The light does not conquer darkness. It negotiates with it, which is much closer to how human beings actually recover from pain. Not instantly, gradually, like winter loosening its grip 1 degree at a time. There was one person who understood exactly what Levitan was doing. Anton Chekhov. The two men were emotional equivalents working in different mediums. Chekhov transformed melancholy into language. Levitan transformed it into atmosphere. Both rejected spectacle. Both distrusted grand heroism. Both understood that most human suffering occurs quietly, inside ordinary days that history never records. Their friendship was intense, complicated, sometimes fractured. They argued, separated, reconciled. But beneath everything, they recognized the same emotional truth in one another. That loneliness does not always isolate people. Sometimes it allows them to recognize each other more clearly. Today, they rest in the same cemetery in Moscow. As if history itself understood they belong to the same conversation. Levitan died in 1900. He was only 39 years old. Heart disease had slowly destroyed his body for years. Depression followed him almost constantly. And yet, out of that instability, he created some of the most emotionally truthful landscapes in history. Not because he painted Russia accurately, because he painted human vulnerability accurately. loneliness, distance, silence, temporary hope, emotional exhaustion, fragile peace. That is why his paintings continue to survive across generations. They do not merely show us a country. They show us psychological states we recognize inside ourselves. And perhaps that leaves us with one final question. What would Levitan have painted if life had been kinder to him? If his country had accepted him? If childhood had felt safe? If his body had not betrayed him? Perhaps brighter paintings. Perhaps happier ones. But then, this question. Would a man who belonged, a man who was never displaced, a man who never learned to love a country from the outside, would he have found a way to make you feel less alone inside your own silence? Or would those roads have simply been roads? That is the most unsettling possibility hidden inside Levitan's work. Not just that suffering can be survived, but that certain forms of beauty only become possible after the wound.